say when.
Okay.
Shall I start?
I want you to start, Van.
Okay, thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Van Goss from Historians for Peace and Democracy, and my only role here is to moderate this discussion. The focus is on McCarthyism, new and old, and we are very honored to have the great historian of McCarthyism, Ellen Schrecker, leading us off. Ellen is going to talk about the parallels and distinctions between the past and present, and then we will hear from Jennifer Ruth of the AAUP talking about a campaign to have faculty senates pass resolutions censoring this new McCarthyism. And then Jesse Hagopian of the Zinn Educational Project will talk to us about some of their key work fighting back on the side of K-12 teachers. So on that note, at the end, we hope to have room for Q&A. And you can just post the Q&A to everyone in the chat, and I will moderate that so that we give as many people as possible a chance. So Ellen, I believe it's over to you.
Thanks so much, Van. And thank you, Cole, Harrison, and the Mass Peace Action people for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts about McCarthyism, which is something I have been studying and writing about since the early 1970s, I guess, when I first was teaching a small seminar in the 1950s and found myself unable to find any books about McCarthyism. And I knew it was important. I'd lived through it. My sixth grade teacher had been fired then because of it, although I didn't know it at the time. And I decided finally to write the book myself. And you will notice that I do use the term McCarthyism. It is historically incorrect, I have to admit, but it's a very useful way to refer to that anti-communist political, oh dear, something happened to my screen and I'm sorry.
I just started sharing your slides, Ellen, and it may have changed the layout on your screen. Sorry.
Okay, well, I'm not getting anything much now, but I'm often asked, because I've done so much about McCarthyism. Let me start over. It is useful to use the term McCarthyism. Everybody knows the anti-communist political repression of the early Cold War. And I've often been asked over the years, is today's latest atrocity, how does that compare with McCarthyism? And I usually sort of fudge around and say, well, it depends on the context. But, today I can't waffle. Today it really is worse, especially in the field of education. Because what? Oh, God. Now what?
Ellen, you probably got two devices turned on in the same room. You can't do that.
Okay, Mark,
They hear each other.
Mark, turn it off. Okay, is that?
Turn my
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. Okay. No. What's happening? What do we do?
Can that reverberation also be if someone else is unmuted?
Is it Mark Blackman? Who's the other person, Ellen?
What?
I think everyone but Ellen needs to mute and see if that changes it.
Could everyone on this call please mute?
He's left the meeting. I can't hear him. Okay. Okay, now we are, I hope, okay. So anyhow, I'm sorry. What's worse today is, especially with regard to education, is that during the McCarthy period, it targeted individuals. But today, the political repression is moving into the classrooms, and it's forcing teachers to deny the truth about racism and other unpleasant aspects of the American past. And we're seeing it, all over the place. A recent iteration occurred in Wisconsin with a few weeks ago when they passed a law, outlawing the usual stuff like critical race theory, but added a sort of list, an addenda of 88 words or phrases that couldn't be used. Among them, social justice, equity, racial prejudice. Now, this isn't new. American political repression has always operated with a strand of anti-intellectualism, especially with regard to education. In the period before the Civil War, it was illegal in the South to teach slaves to read. After the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan and other vigilante groups burned down the schoolhouses that the recently freed Black communities had built. In the 1930s, for example, politicians and others passed laws ordering that teachers take oaths, swearing that they would uphold the Constitution of the United States and the particular state in which they lived. Those oaths continued and intensified during the McCarthy period. Probably the most notorious was the University of California's 1949 loyalty oath that not only specifically targeted the members of the university's faculty, but also contained a so-called disclaimer that added a clause in which the teacher would have to deny that he or she belonged to a party that organized, that believes in or advocates or teaches the overthrow of the United States government, essentially by force and violence. This was directed against the Communist Party, of course, but even after McCarthyism sort of died down, these same kind of repressive measures were being continued after the McCarthy period. Probably one of the most notorious was the Arkansas Law number 10 of 1958. That forced teachers to list all the organizations that they had belonged to or given money to. And it was directly a response to President Eisenhower's decision to send the National Guard to Little Rock to protect the 9 brave Black students who were trying to integrate the high school there. That law was overturned, but in 1960. But today, similar measures are, of course, cropping up as well. As we begin to explore the way in which McCarthyism operated and dominated American political life in the 1950s, we've got to get rid of a bunch of myths. One of the most deleterious conflates this guy, Joseph McCarthy, the man, with McCarthyism, the movement. And we can see similar myths today. As the mainstream politicians and the media are focusing rather horrendously on the behavior of a certain Donald Trump. And thus they're ignoring the forces that have spent decades pushing American politics to the right. Because the process of identifying a episode of political repression with a single individual really trivializes it. It treats something like McCarthy as an aberration and not part of a broader mainstream phenomenon. Because McCarthy, as we know, did not create McCarthyism. He was important, but he came late to his own party, which really began in the late 1940s with a set of very sensationalized congressional hearings and trials. And probably more important, the President Truman's Loyalty Security Program of 1947 that was largely designed by the FBI. And the FBI was, in fact, central to McCarthyism. If any single individual could be identified with it, it wouldn't have been McCarthy, it would have been Hoover. He and his 8 allies spread scenarios that legitimized McCarthyism and that created and operated the machinery that implemented it. Now, compared to more brutal regimes and compared to more violent episodes earlier in American history, McCarthyism was relatively mild. Only 2 people were killed. There they are, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Several hundred went to prison, and about 12 to 15,000 folks lost their jobs, although there may be more because we simply don't know. A lot of this stuff was secret. But mild as it was here we have some pictures of the most famous group of McCarthy victims, probably the Hollywood 10. Not only did they go to prison, but they were, of course, blacklisted. But mild as McCarthyism was, it was very effective in quashing dissent during the 1940s and especially 1950s. It functioned in accordance with a 2-step procedure. The first step was that of identification. It was handled usually by a public government body of some kind, the FBI, a congressional committee, or else by a journalist or professional blacklister. The second stage was the application of sanctions. And this was usually done by employers, public and private, many of whom claimed they opposed McCarthyism, which they tended to identify with only that first stage of exposure. But by firing the people who were identified during that first stage, they created an anti-communist political test for employment. That was what made McCarthyism so successful. Now, there's another myth as well that we need to deal with, and that's the notion that most of the victims of McCarthyism were, quote unquote, innocent liberals. Well, most of the victims of McCarthyism were people who had some kind of connection to the broader communist movement. The Communist Party had been the most dynamic group on the left during the 1930s and early 40s. As a result, because McCarthyism was specifically directed against American communism, and was designed, in fact, to eliminate.
And unmute is for you not to speak.
What?
But that would be for me not to speak.
In any event, because of the focus on communism, when McCarthyism began to select its targets, it reached mostly people of the whole generation of left-wing political activists who had functioned within the broader penumbra of the Communist Party, even though by no means all of them were Communist Party members. Now, we have to face the fact that the Communist Party had some serious flaws, in particular its ties to the Soviet Union, as well as the secrecy that it imposed upon its own members. It was not a large party, it was not powerful, and it had been under attack ever since it was founded in the immediate aftermath of World War I. But it was the Cold War that turned the longtime campaign against the unpopular communist movement into the dominant element in American domestic politics during the early Cold War. Its tie to the Soviet Union caused it to become a matter of national security. But, and this is crucial, McCarthyism did not spontaneously emerge once the Cold War began. It was a product of years of demonization by right-wing coalitions that created and disseminated wildly inflated scenarios about the dangers of American communism. Now, what made these scenarios so powerful was that they were plausible. And that's a big difference from today's culture wars, which are built, as we know, on pretty much outright lies. But there was a kernel of truth within these demonized scenarios about American communism. There was espionage, definitely espionage. As we know, communists had been involved during World War II when the United States and the Soviet Union were allied against Hitler, but they had given information to the Soviet Union. That espionage ended with the end of the war. They were also, communists, very active in the labor movement. And this allowed J. Edgar Hoover and his allies to create scenarios that portrayed communist labor leaders as calling political strikes against defense industries or engaging in sabotage at their plants that they were working in. That didn't happen either. And then there's the trope about communists in government and the so-called loss of China. This was a story that claimed that a small group of foreign service officers who served in China during World War II had somehow betrayed China to Mao Zedong. It supposedly explained why the United States was losing the Cold War, as if the United, which it wasn't, as if the United, and also clearly China was hardly the United States' to lose. Sorry. Yeah. I'm very sorry. What is going on here? Okay. Anyhow, within the field of education, for example, this demonization operated to spread the notion that communist teachers were indoctrinating their students. That didn't happen. But by the 1950s, communism had been so demonized that any kind of contact with it would make somebody unfit to teach, or maybe take any other kind of job as well. Now, where did this demonization come from? As is happening today, with that explosion of misinformation about and demonization of the current drive for social and political justice, it didn't come from the grassroots. Today's movement of repression is the product of a decades-long campaign by a sophisticated and lavishly endowed network of right-wing organizations and think tanks like the Manhattan Institute, whose staffer, Christopher Ruffo, we see here, seems to be the point person for the attack on critical race theory. Now, the same thing happened during the McCarthy period. It too was a product of interconnected networks of anti-communist professionals, not as well founded or funded as, or as sophisticated as today's similar activists, but they did work together for years to create and disseminate the scenarios that provided the rationale for the Cold War witch hunt. And they then managed to supply the names and information that fed those purges. It was a kind of motley group of individuals, professional witnesses, right-wing journalists, and politicians, labor leaders, the FBI, and other law enforcement agencies. And they were surprisingly self-conscious about themselves. A small group of them actually talked about themselves as Red Baiters Incorporated. And just to give you an example of the scope of these kinds of activities, I'd like to look at the career of this gentleman. His name is J.B. Matthews. He's not a household word today, but in the 1950s, he was considered the quote unquote dean of anti-communism. He had begun his career as a Protestant minister in the 1930s, had been on the left, joined a lot of front groups connected to the communist movement, and then flipped, became radically conservatives, went onto the staff of HUAC during the late 1930s. And by the Cold War, this gentleman was ubiquitous. He had been collecting letterheads from left-wing organizations for years and relied upon them in his work as a widely consulted expert and professional witness who testified at trials and congressional hearings and immigration proceedings. He was on the, had a retainer from the right-wing Volcker Foundation. He was working with the Hearst Press and was also a member of a small group that was routinely consulted by Hollywood producers to pass on the political acceptability of people that they wanted to hire. In other words, he was a blacklister. At the peak of Joseph McCarthy's notoriety, he tried to hire Matthews in 1953 as the research director for his newly formed senatorial investigating committee. But Matthews had published an article claiming that the Protestant ministers in the mainstream denominations were harboring subversives. And to be quite frank, he was simply too radioactive even for Joseph McCarthy. But Matthews continued to trot his dog and pony show around the rest of the country, including showing up in Arkansas to testify in favor of its law number 10. And then there's the Republican Party. Just as today's wave of political repression is being fueled by partisan politics, so too was McCarthyism. Though there were a few right-wing Democrats who joined the anti-communist crusade, most of it was a Republican product. The leaders of the Republican Party recognized after Harry Truman's surprise victory in the 1948 election that very few American voters were entranced by their opposition to the New Deal's reforms, and that they needed to find themselves a new issue. And so they found it. They latched onto the anti-communist community's ready-made scenario that the Democratic administrations of Truman and Roosevelt had been riddled with Reds. And these charges of communists in government caught on very quickly. They were plausible, they were dramatic, the narratives were easy to understand, and they brought enormous publicity to ambitious politicians like this gentleman, Richard Nixon, whose dogged pursuit of Alger Hiss in 1948 launched his political career. The loss of China became a particularly important trope for Republicans. And it was no surprise that Joe McCarthy latched onto it immediately when he began his early charges about communists in government that launched his own career. The final and perhaps most important reason why McCarthyism became so powerful was that, with almost no exceptions, the mainstream institutions of the United States colluded with the anti-communist crusade, from universities and public school systems to hospitals and major corporations. Whenever their institutions, their employees came under attack by the witch hunters, the moderates and liberals running these institutions, who knew perfectly well that these people were posing no threat to the United States, nonetheless fired them. They simply felt they were unable to avoid controversy any other way. So too, in other ways, I would argue, the Democratic Party, the Supreme Court, and the mainstream press facilitated the Red Scare by legitimizing its underlying assumptions. At the same time, other groups that you might have assumed would have resisted the purges, like the ACLU and the American Association of University Professors, were conspicuous by their absence. Ultimately, the main opposition to the Cold War Red Scare came from its victims. Their personal suffering cannot be ignored, but McCarthyism's main damage was political. It marginalized the left, it narrowed the American political spectrum, and made it impossible for certain ideas to gain a hearing or even to be expressed. The mainstream civil rights organizations, for example, purged their own ranks of leftists and then abandoned all attempts to deal with economic issues. When I was teaching a class before I retired in contemporary American history, I used to ask my students to give me their impression of the anti-war movement during the Korean War. And I always got the same answer: complete silence. And I said, yep, that's right. The criticism of the Cold War simply disappeared. Ordinary citizens feared becoming involved with anything that might be associated with the Communist Party. And one former party activist that I interviewed told me that when he was a graduate student in physics at the University of Chicago, he wanted to present a petition to the department asking for the installation of a Coke machine in the lab for the students who were working on their experiments late at night. But when he circulated that petition, none of his fellow students were willing to sign. People during the McCarthy period had gotten in trouble for having signed petitions in the 1930s and 40s. McCarthyism finally came to an end. It petered out by the late 50s. The witch hunt had run out of its witches. Joseph McCarthy self-destructed on national TV, and members of the establishment began to regain something of a backbone. But I think a more important reason why the Red Scare faded away was the growth of the civil rights movement. As that massive social movement began to develop, it forced the rest of the nation to pay attention to the real issues that required action, not the manufactured scenarios of the anti-communist crusade. But as we're seeing today, similar campaigns can return if they're not strongly opposed. If we've learned anything from the McCarthy period, it's the need for collective action. We need to press that rational, all too gutless, moderate majority to stand up against something like the current threat to the truth. It's no time to mourn. We have to organize. And I think, as our next panelist will show, there's some of that going on right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Van, you are muted, but I think
I know, I thought I'd done it. I am unmuted. We are now turning to Jennifer Ruth of the AAUP, who is going to talk to us about some practical things that those of us on campus or with friends on campus can do to oppose this vicious new campaign of intellectual repression.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that I'm actually speaking more on behalf of the AAPF Higher Education Working Group, the African American Policy Forum. I've been very active in AAUP and I remain very active. I'm on AAUP's Committee A for Academic Freedom, and I'm working with AAUP on some of this, but the actual thing that I'm going to talk to you guys about today was worked out in coordination with Emily Ho, who is on this on the Zoom, I think. Emily, if you want to chime in, please do. So through the African American Policy Forum, which is Kimberly Crenshaw's forum, and the executive director is Sumi Cho, we've been trying to figure out what kinds of collective actions can be taken. And Jesse's next going to speak from the Zen Education Project, is going to speak to a teach-in day that we're doing. But the thing that we would like to do to try and mount some strong defense that's both simultaneous to some of this legislation and preempts some of its worst effects is to try and get collective faculty action. One of the things that, if you've read Ellen's book, No Ivory Tower, one of the things you see is that, individuals can get picked off. And as she just explained, individuals get picked off and then that chills everybody, right? And you might have an administrator who's brave here in one place and gets a little bit of media attention, other administrators who throw their people under the bus, and it's just sort of hodgepodge. And so it never amounts to a serious defense of academic freedom. And so I want you to say again so I can write it down. So it doesn't have to be now, but if we've learned anything from McCarthyism, it's the moderate gutless majority. Whatever that line was, I want to start using it, because it's the people, the academics who don't see themselves as doing critical race theory, who don't think that I don't have a dog in this fight necessarily. They do. We all have a dog in the fight of academic freedom, and someone trying to tell us what we can teach and what our curriculum is. They come after, there's no question in my mind that this is in McCarthyism 2.0. And academics need to do faculty, everybody needs to do a better job refusing and rejecting this assault on academic freedom and the right to tell the truth about our history. So here's what we've got going. So if you may not, I know we have a group that was drawn for, because Ellen's work. And so I don't know how many of you are at academic institutions right now. And I know Jesse next is going to speak to K through 12 a bit. So we might have some K through 12 people. We might have some higher ed people. We might have some nonprofits. We might have retired historians, whoever we are. If you're at an institution, am I sharing screen? No, I'm not, am I? I need to share screen because I want to show you what we've got going on. If you have connections, if you know activists at academic institutions, if you yourself are, or if you're retired, you know some people who are still active, who can pursue something on their campus. What we're trying to do, and I'll start with, is this the one that I want to start with? Yes, okay, great. I'll start with this cover letter. So we've actually, this is the work we've done so far. We've sent to 50 public flagship institutions. Some have responded and are working on it. Some we haven't heard back from. So we just need everyone who's got connections to higher ed to work your connections. So this is a letter that was sent by the through African American Policy Forum, and AAUP sent it out as well. But by critical race theory summer school faculty who write about why these divisive concepts legislation, anti-CRT legislation, what it means, and why we have to demonstrate, as you see here, that faculty are organized on our own campuses to fight back. So this is the letter that we sent. We sent to different faculty senates. It's been a fairly arbitrary who it gets to, which is precisely why we need people who have roots in different institutions to follow up for us, or to pursue it if we didn't get to that institution. So this is a letter that we sent to people across the country. And it's what we have is we're asking people to adapt a resolution for their faculty senate to use shared governance to say, no, we're not going to allow partisanship to interfere with what we do in the classroom or violate our academic freedom. So we've created a template, and then we've also created, we've also given examples. That's not what I want. I'm sharing, right? Am I sharing?
Yes, you are sharing.
Okay. Here's an example. I'm at Portland State University, and here's an example of how my colleagues and I adapted the template we created, the higher ed working group created, and we just brought it to the steering committee. And I will be very surprised, actually, if it doesn't pass. I expect it to pass. But we provide a little background using Ellen, McCarthyism has returned. And then we have whereas, given the background of the state legislative proposals. And then we're basically saying, whereas, and we ask people to draw on statements that the institution has already made. For example, after George Floyd's murder, if they said something, if an institution made an official sort of announcement about racial justice, to sort of tie in stuff from AAUP about academic freedom, tie in official statements of an institution or a senate that previously made about racial justice. And then we say faculty senate resolutely rejects any attempts by bodies external to the faculty to restrict or dictate university curriculum. We say we stand with our K through 12 colleagues who might be affected by this pernicious legislation. And then we specifically suggest that people call on their actual president and provost, their administrators, to affirm that they support the faculty senate resolution. So that's what we've got going on. And we're really hoping, it already passed. One of the other people in our higher ed working group with me and Emily is Valerie Johnson, a political scientist at DePaul. Because we were the first to know that we were doing this, we were bringing it to our senates before other people have a chance to. She's already passed hers unanimously at DePaul University. So we have one resolution that passed unanimously. We've got a number that are on the agendas. I'm particularly excited, and I'll try to wrap it up here, but I'm particularly excited about the fact that the chair of the Academic Freedom Committee at University of Texas, Austin, is determined to pass this resolution. And she, as with shared governance, and that's why it's a collective act, trying to speak in one voice is notoriously difficult for academics, right? So we don't know, it won't pass everywhere. But if it passes at places like UT Austin, and if it passes at enough places, it sends a really strong message. And hopefully there'll also be media attention to these resolutions. And then we can say, we won't look back at this moment with the same regret we look back at, we won't see ourselves as the gutless moderate majority that threw the left under the bus next time around. So what I'm gonna ask you is that at the end of, when our event is over, Jesse Hagopian from Zen Education Project is going to talk next. But when the event is over, the organizers are going to say, thank you for coming, and send you my email, which I'll go ahead and put in the chat. Let's see, let me make sure I'm putting it to everyone. My email, and remind you about this resolution. And if you're at an institution, any higher ed institution at all, and you think you can find some allies or find a Senate committee or some senators who will help you pass this resolution. It doesn't matter if the legislation is pending or passed in your state or not. We want everyone to send this message, regardless of what state they're in. Here's my email. But if you're at an institution and you think you might want to take on some of this work, we've tried to make it as easy as possible for you. Please help us out and bring this forward at your institutions. Emily, you want to add anything? My partner in crime at AAPF.
Nope, I'm just trying to drop links into the chat for people.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, great. Emily just gave you guys the link to the page on the AAPF website that actually has the materials that I just showed you on the screen share. So between that link and my email, please do what you can to make this sort of movement of collective faculty action take off. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jesse Hagopian, who's going to tell us more about K through 12 and a teach-in National Day of Action on October 14th. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I greatly appreciate all the comments from Professor Ellen Schrecker and learned so much that is going to be so useful in arming teachers with the knowledge of how these attacks happened in the late 40s, early 50s to help us keep our colleagues safe today. Because in 11 states across the US, it is illegal to teach the truth to children about structural racism in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Texas, Tennessee, and Utah, right? They want to require us to lie to kids. And to date, some 28 states have introduced this legislation to try to obscure the truth about racism and sexism and other forms of oppression in the classroom. They've attacked the 1619 Project. They've attacked the Zen Education Project that I work for. And Black Lives Matter at School has been one of the primary targets of this right-wing attack. And in the boundless satire that is the United States of America, at the same time that Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday, right, this oldest commemoration of the ending of slavery, we have a situation where it is becoming illegal to teach about it in Texas, in the place that it began, and in places across the country. And the land of the free, I believe, continues to take on new and intricate shades of mockery in our society today. And, I think that you really have to take a look at what this attack looks like on K-12 teachers to understand the severity that's going on right now. There was a teacher, Matthew Hahn from Tennessee, who was fired from his job for assigning a Ta-Nehisi Coates essay. We're talking about a New York Times best-selling author, not some obscure radical, right? And a poem. He assigned a poem by Kayla Janae Lacey about white privilege, right? There's a teacher in Florida, Amy Dorofono, who was fired for having a Black Lives Matter flag in her classroom. Guess why she had to have that flag in her classroom? She taught at a school called Robert E. Lee High School, named after a Confederate general, a genocidal maniac who seceded from the country in order to continue the enslavement and genocide of Black people, right? You have teachers in my home state of Washington. We're talking about a blue state that doesn't have the legislature proposed, and yet we have several school districts that have individually passed these types of bans on critical race theory. And as well, teachers have received physical threats, right, on their livelihood, on their very being, for signing Zen Education Project's pledge to teach the truth. And these attacks are simply just proving the tenets of critical race theory correct, which is, I think, the great irony of it, because, those who are pushing against critical race theory really confirms the central claim of critical race theory that racism is embedded in the law even when it appears to be race neutral, right? And then one of the other central claims of critical race theory is that when you have a mass pushback against racism, when there's an uprising for racial justice, there will be a backlash to that uprising, right? And the uprising of 2020 is really what spurred so many more educators across the country to begin discussions about how that could have happened to Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Tony McDade and too many others to name, right? And now we're experiencing the backlash that is showing much of critical race theory to be more relevant than ever. And I want to make I want to really emphasize this point, that it's not just the worst attacks that we're seeing that's the problem, right? The firing of teachers and the threats against their lives have been horrific, but far more commonplace and insidious is the chilling effect that that's having on classrooms. Because a teacher that I spoke to in Iowa, who's part of the Black Lives Matter at School movement, named Monique, she explained to me that some of her white colleagues began trying to diversify their curriculum in the wake of the 2020 uprising. So one teacher added Alice Walker's short story, The Flowers, to her curriculum. It's a story about a young Black girl who comes across a dead body who's presumably a Black man who'd been lynched. And then she thought, you know what? With this law passing in Iowa banning the teaching of structural racism, I could lose my job teaching about this. So she put the book back on the shelf, right? And this is happening across America in countless other classrooms and is part of the strategy of the radical right. And I just want to emphasize that, you know, the way that that McCarthyism operated in the 1950s was not just to hunt out communists, but I think really was wielded as a weapon against the labor movement and against movements for racial justice, right? And I think, you know, the same thing is today. You have people like Christopher Rufo and many politicians calling critical race theory Marxism and wielding it against movements for racial justice. So I'll just end by saying that I believe that the primary way that this billionaire class maintains its power in our society is by controlling what is acceptable knowledge and enforcing what Henry Giroux has called the violence of organized forgetting, right? And so I think that the current attacks on critical race theory, on ethnic studies, on critical pedagogy is more than just distraction from the real economic issues, but an actual attempt at epistemicide, right? The killing or silencing or annihilation of entire systems of knowledge. And I'll just end with the words of the great educator, Septima Clark, one of my heroes, who was fired for her involvement with the NAACP and her fighting for social justice and racial justice. And she said, I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. So thanks, everybody. I hope you will. I guess I should just, I want to just emphasize that we have a great opportunity on Thursday, October 14th, to join this movement, that everybody can participate in the National Day of Action on October 14th, which is George Floyd's birthday. And we're calling on everyone to sign the pledge if you're an educator to teach the truth, that we can drop in the chat. We're calling on everybody to wear shirts in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter at School movement. Wearing a black shirt or a Black Lives Matter at School shirt. And you can conduct virtual field trips of civil rights museums with young people that you're associated with. And you can support educators in your community in doing this work. So thank you.
Can't hear you, Van. Doesn't look like you're muted by Zoom. Somehow your mic may not be picking you up. Nope. Lips moving, nothing coming out.
Okay, how's this?
Better, better, better.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a bad cable. Anyway, thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Jennifer. This has been extremely informative. We have just a few minutes for a Q&A. Let's see what questions we might have. Michael Hoey asked, was the Lavender scare part of the Red Scare or a different scare? And might I add, is it related to what is happening now? Ellen, I think that's you. Was the Lavender scare part of the Red Scare or a different scare? You would need to unmute.
You're
Oh,
muted, Alan.
You're muted. Ellen.
Okay.
Now we got you. All right.
Oh, the Lavender scare. It's related. It's related. You know, it wasn't exactly the same thing. It had, but you know, this was a period when homosexuals were so deeply in the closet that yes, exposure could really damage them, just like exposure was damaging so many political radicals at the same time. I mean, they did operate at the same time. And some of the leaders of the gay movement were in fact former communists, but the Communist Party also tried to purge its gay members because it was afraid of a kind of double exposure. Anyhow, it was part of it, but as we say, it did not dare say its name. What can we say?
Okay, let's see. Do we have other questions? Victoria Best is asking if you could comment on the laws passed on several campuses in several states and some state laws criminalizing those who show support for BDS against the government of Israel for their ongoing treatment of Palestinians. Is this related, the anti-BDS laws, do you think? Anyone?
Well, I think that's very much a sort of modern form of McCarthyism, especially because it's targeting a political movement. It's, you know, impeding their free speech. I also think that what has not sort of penetrated outside of sort of academic freedom circles is the realization that most of the victims, as it were, of academic violations of academic freedom these days have some connection to the Israel issue. And it's not because they're supporting the government of Israel.
Let's see, right now, I don't see any other questions.
So I would just add to that, when Ellen discussed the way in which the McCarthyism was not spontaneous, but was years in the making and was coordination among different groups, that's exactly what we're seeing now. We're seeing people who don't necessarily aren't focused on the Palestinian issue, but they will make common ground with Israel, pro-Israeli, anti-Palestinian kinds of groups in order to push their conservative issue. And we're seeing for example, Campus Reform, which is a conservative right-wing newspaper outlet that focuses on higher ed, it's got $6 million in funding from the Koch Foundation. So they're all intercoordinated, and they're sort of bringing their issues together and supporting one another, even if they don't care about that issue. And it's very similar in that way in terms of long years in the making and a lot of funding going towards this. The thing that I'm particularly concerned about is the way in which these laws, the particular laws about banning CRT, not banning 1619, not talking about divisive concepts, the way that these laws deputize students and parents and create a kind of paralegal, just like with redemption and the white citizens councils, and the way in which you had these posses, these militias that were not officially police or whatever, but they were they worked with police to suppress voters, Black voters, et cetera. We're going to see the same kind of coordination with the campus reform and these laws and these legislators that are politically ambitious in the same way that the people in the McCarthy era were politically ambitious in using this issue. And that really scares me. We already see it on an individual by individual, but it's going to ramp up majorly, the deputizing of students and parents to go after K through 12 and higher ed faculty.
Yeah, think about it. People sitting in your class, recording everything you do on their cell phones and sending it out. Not a
Yes.
happy prospect.
And part of the problem here is that there are campus disciplinary processes are, as many of us know, I'm not speaking personally here, extremely opaque. They are not, whether affecting students or faculty, they are in fact star chambers. And of course, I understand that under certain circumstances, this can run into a certain right wing, like fire, critique of anti-hate speech and so on. But I'm concerned that these opaque processes could be weaponized against, because we're dealing with people who are completely cynical and opportunistic, will be weaponized against people like us. That someone will, for instance, say that, speaking out in favor of, God knows, 1619 or BDS was a personal assault, was hostile, was constituted harassment, all of those words, right? And then, the same kind of, scared, gutless moderates that Ellen has talked about will react in the same way. And indeed, we've seen, Title IX claims weaponized against gay and lesbian faculty in some notorious instances. Someone who simply wanted to destroy someone's career has made charges of sexual harassment, and administrations back off. So anyway, we will get a copy there will be a copy of this recording. Are there any court challenges to anti-CRT laws? Victor Wallace asks, because that would be something, I guess, right?
Actually, I think Emily can speak to this. Emily, you've been following the court challenge more than I have. Emily, are you still here? Emily might not be still here. There is one. I haven't looked into it very closely, but and I'm sorry to say I haven't, so I can't explain it, but I know there's one out there
Emily's
brewing.
here,
Oh,
but she's
Sorry?
not unmuting yet.
she can't unmute.
Here I am.
Oh, good.
Sorry. So I think there are court challenges or a court challenge forthcoming, but I don't know much more than that, and I'm not at liberty to say much more than that. So, but just stay tuned. I think probably it's coming.
Okay, so I'm putting into the chat a link to Historians for Peace and Democracy, which did organize this webinar, because if you are in any way connected to, higher ed, or just an activist scholar of any sort, feel free to join us. There's no large major dues payment. We just are looking for people who want to do some activist work on campus, around campus, off campus, using history as a tool in a fight against the white nationalist authoritarian right, which is in fact right now the central mission of Historians for Peace and Democracy, or HPAD as we call it. So look in the chat and you can see it should be www. I think everyone got that mistake. Historiansforpeace.org. And we welcome members, and we are gearing up for this fight with, I want to she won't say it, Ellen Schrecker in leadership. And she's the right person to be doing it. No, you are. So I think we're at
I feel like
8:04.
Rip Van Winkle in the face of
No.
technology.
You've got the expertise, and we have tremendous allies here in the APF and in the Zinn Education Project, and hopefully in AAUP. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Jesse. This was really great. I got a lot out of it, and we will sign off now. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.